claims it has carried out a successful test of an underwater nuclear-capable drone.
The isolated regime carrying out its biggest nuclear test to date, and some analysts claiming it was more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Japan.
North Korea is one of the most isolated and closed-off countries in the world, which is why we know remarkably little about life inside this mysterious nation. These days, the most common stories we hear about it involve Kim Jong-un threatening the world with nuclear weapons, the crushing poverty and famine brought on by international sanctions, or the horrific human rights abuses suffered by its people. So most of the time, news from North Korea is grim. But here's something far fewer people know. North Korea once committed the largest car theft in history, and to understand how the world's most brutal dictatorship pulled this off, we need to travel back in time a few decades. The story begins in the 1970s, when North Korea was nowhere near as isolated as it is today. Right now, the country's trade ties are limited almost entirely to China, Russia, and Iran. But in the 1970s, it wasn't just Soviet bloc nations doing business with Pyongyang. Several neutral countries were also trying to establish trade relations with the communist state. Sweden was one of them. Back then, many saw great economic potential in North Korea. That might sound absurd today, considering it's now one of the poorest countries on Earth, with most of its people living in poverty and hunger, and millions starving to death in the famine of the 1990s. But in the 1970s, the picture looked very different. North Korea's economy was growing at a pace similar to South Korea's, and in the early part of the decade, its GDP per capita was even higher than that of its southern neighbor. With growth like that, it made perfect sense for neutral nations to try building trade ties. If the trend had continued, it could have meant substantial profits. By 1970, economic relations between Sweden and North Korea were in full bloom. Major Swedish companies began exporting products there, and in 1975, Sweden even hosted a trade expo in Pyongyang. That same year, it became the first Western country to open an embassy in North Korea. At first, things seemed promising. In 1974, Kim Il-sung, North Korea's leader at the time, placed a huge order for Swedish industrial goods. The list included industrial machinery, mining equipment, and, most famously, 1,000 Volvo 144 cars. Sweden manufactured and delivered everything as agreed, but then came the shock. Kim Il-sung simply refused to pay. The unpaid bill amounted to over $70 million at the time, and Sweden had no real way to force an isolated dictatorship to settle its debt. Decades later, those Volvo 144s can still be spotted on North Korea's eerily empty streets, while Sweden continues sending payment reminders twice a year, reminders that, unsurprisingly, have no effect. With interest, the debt has now grown to around $330 million, and it's almost certain it will never be paid. There's another side to this story, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, let's look at what happened after the theft of those 1,000 Volvos. Once the world saw that North Korea was not a reliable partner and ignored international agreements, its list of trading partners shrank even further. By the 1980s, the number of countries willing to do business with Pyongyang had dropped sharply. The Volvo theft didn't just hurt trade, it also helped North Korea's greatest rival, South Korea, pull ahead. Western countries, seeing that South Korea was far more open and trustworthy, shifted their attention there. Trade flourished, development accelerated, and South Korea quickly transformed into one of the most advanced and livable nations on the planet, thanks in large part to its strong relationships with the West. Now, back to that other thread in the story. As mentioned earlier, Sweden was the first Western country to open an embassy in Pyongyang. They sent an experienced diplomat, Eric Cornell, who had served as ambassador in Germany, Poland, and Ethiopia. Cornell arrived in the winter of 1975 to find the country eerily empty. Nothing but snow, wind, and bitter cold. There were no cafes, no restaurants, no public places to gather. There was nothing to do except perhaps get into a Volvo 144 and drive around. When Cornell reported his impressions to the Swedish government, he was asked to assess the real state of North Korea's economy. His conclusion? The official figures suggesting that North Korea was growing faster than the South were almost certainly false. According to Cornell, the regime had greatly exaggerated its industrial capacity and had little understanding of how to trade with countries outside the Soviet bloc. The mining equipment and other machinery Sweden had delivered? Never used, just left to rust in storage. It quickly became clear to him that North Korea's economy was in serious trouble. Cornell served as ambassador until 1977. But there was at least one silver lining to the Volvo saga. Even though Sweden took a massive financial loss, it gained a more important role as a diplomatic player in the region. To this day, Sweden maintains an embassy in Pyongyang and acts as a key mediator between North Korea and the rest of the world. In fact, much of the communication with the regime still goes through the Swedes, who try to persuade Kim Jong-un to take a more reasonable course. So yes, Sweden lost $70 million in the deal. But it gained influence, strengthened its international standing, and became an even more valuable partner to countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia.